From Hamas to Hezbollah and Iran, Israel has many enemies, but the Houthis have not been among their top targets until recently. In their latest attacks on Sana'a, Israel killed 10 members of the Houthi government, including the group's prime minister, in what could be a shift in their campaign against the group. The Houthis have vowed to retaliate without mercy and to continue what they say is their support for Palestine, which started days after the October 7 attacks in 2023. The Houthis had been targeting ships in the Red Sea, which of course affected commerce more so than anything else, although there have been casualties. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu boasted of delivering a severe blow to the Houthi leadership in Israel's latest attacks. But is this in fact the case? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. In this episode, we discuss Israel's new strategy, or lack thereof, in Yemen, and we ask, can it get away with another bloody war front in the region? And is it following the same playbook it did in Iran and in Lebanon? Sana'a is home to 3.5 million people and is a stronghold of the Houthis. The killing of almost a dozen of their leaders there sends a strong message that Israel is willing to step up its threats. But just how much has the group been affected by this? I discussed this with Bara Shiban, Associate Fellow with the Rusi Defense Think Tank in London. Bara, what has been the impact of these latest Israeli strikes on Sana'a? And are we talking about civilian infrastructure or military infrastructure here mostly when it comes to the targets?
From literally last year, not just from the beginning of the Israeli airstrikes on the Houthis, but even when the US and UK started launching their campaign against the Houthis, the majority of the airstrikes have hit civilian infrastructure that some of it that the Houthis rely on regarding generating income, for example, the multiple strikes on the port of Hodeidah. But the core of the Houthi military structure haven't been attacked, haven't been significantly degraded. With the strike that happened on the Houthi-appointed government in Sana'a, it's a clear indication that there is either lack of information or there is lack of understanding of how the Houthis operate. The individuals who were killed, yes, they work with the Houthis, but they are individuals who run the day-to-day affair of the state institutions on behalf of the Houthis, but they hold no real power.
So far, the Houthis haven't announced whether any of their military leadership was killed in the latest strike. Could this be an intentional strategy on the Houthis' part to not admit if there have been any military casualties? Because we know that they have been sort of tight-lipped about things like this in the past.
So far, if there are some attacks on their military capabilities, meaning that there have been some senior military operatives who have been killed, yes, the Houthis would avoid announcing that in public until they get basically their act together. People think about the Houthis of like just a regular army or like a regular military, but they are an insurgency and they benefit from being an insurgency that they are very decentralized. They won't rely on having, for example, a big military infrastructure. They wouldn't have a military base that you can destroy and degrade. Rather than even when they launch missiles or attack the ships, they rely on basically their ability of them being mobile. And it benefits them at the same time that they are currently not under military pressure, meaning they are not fighting or pushing back against a ground defensive. The Houthis fear more than anything losing territory. But this is not what's happening right now. So they have capability of absorbing an air campaign, even if it's a long air campaign. What they fear, if they start losing many of their commanders, then that could motivate their opponents on the ground to start trying to push and gain leverage on them, meaning they might lose access to, let's say, to the sea, fear losing some key provinces in the areas that they control.
What is the sentiment in Yemen towards the Houthis? Among the group's critics, let's say, how do they feel about the Houthis' anti-Israel campaign and their expression for support for Palestine? And how do people feel about Israel's attacks on the Houthis and their military intervention in Yemen as a whole?
The public are very conflicted in terms of how they react to what's happening. In general, the overwhelming majority of Yemenis are very sympathetic with the Palestinians. And they're very angry from the images, the daily images that we are seeing coming from Gaza. So even if they wouldn't be supportive of the Houthis, they would be not openly criticizing the Houthis because they're being attacked by Israel, which they see is currently, committing horrific crimes in Gaza. However, there is a significant portion of people who feel that they can differentiate between the two. They see the Houthis as a reason of why the Yemeni state infrastructure have been destroyed. They see his actions are being reckless. And also the way how the Houthis governed over the last decade is very oppressive. Now, in literally the day after the Houthi appointed cabinet or government was hit by the Israeli airstrike, they went on to detain UN staff, Yemeni UN staff members. There isn't anyone in Yemen who doesn't know a friend, a relative, a cousin who has been detained or been mistreated by the Houthis. So many people, even if they sympathize with the Palestinians, can also at the same time have very strong feelings against the Houthis.
The missiles that the Houthis fired at Israel haven't been really damaging, and yet Israel responded with the killing of the Houthi prime minister and a number of officials. So, what are the options now that the Houthis have? Are we at risk of seeing an all out war break out between the two sides, what happened between Israel and Iran?
The Houthis will continue to escalate because they want to show that in front of their base, that they're not weak, that they're able to hit back. It's clear that Iran has directed a lot of its attention in propping up the Houthis because of what's happening with Hezbollah. Hezbollah needs time to basically get its act together. The Houthis will try and develop their capabilities until they get to the point that they can actually cause damage inside Israel. And that's a method that we've seen that they've done, for example, in the past with Saudi Arabia. In the beginning of their missiles, it was very few that didn't hit anywhere. But as the time was moving, their ability to hit key infrastructure, to hit oil facilities significantly improved, even if it doesn't cause any damage. But they want just enough show that they can mobilize the public around them and to continue recruiting.
Could this escalate to the point where we see Israel turning Sana'a into Gaza?
That is a very good question that many Yemenis fear. So the many critics of the Houthis are feeling that the tactics of the Houthis are very risky, very careless, and can lead to, as you said, even more and more destruction. Now, the main difference is that the Houthis control a huge space of land. It's even much bigger than Lebanon, for example, the entirety of Lebanon, compared to this tiny space in Gaza. And with that, the Houthi operatives have many places that they can maneuver, they can hide. The area that they are in control is very mountainous. So in that sense, they're feeling a little bit more comfortable that the Israelis won't be able to inflict such damage, although they can inflict damage on the populated cities. But again, this is not a traditional army. This is an insurgency. And one common mistake many states have when they're trying to fight the Houthis is that they deal with them as an army, when they're anything but an army.
Anything but an army. They may have the same sponsors as other Iran-backed actors in the region, but they're not exactly the same. And yet Israel appears to be going after Houthi leadership as it did with Hamas and with Hezbollah. To talk more about this, I'm joined now by Yovan Iliev from the Terrorism Research and Analysis Consortium, TRAC. So, Yovan, Israel has targeted the political leadership of Hamas, both inside and outside of Gaza, and it assassinated Hezbollah's leadership, most notably Hassan Nasrallah last year. These groups have both basically met their demise militarily. Is Israel trying to use the same approach now with the Houthis, do you think?
Well, I would say that first of all, it's still difficult to surmise whether these groups have been totally militarily defeated, in the sense that the IDF does have, functional control over Gaza, but we see the Qassam brigades are still able to actively target the IDF. With Hezbollah, we saw mostly a political defeat, one that was majorly also, again, shook up its internal structure, especially its leadership structure. But the actual advancements on the ground, for example, even taking, for example, the 2006 war as a point of comparison, were quite a bit less. On the second point, pursuing the Houthis, I think that Israeli calculus has shifted towards the Houthis more as it has been able to see these, significant successes in its backyard, so to speak. But the physical distance between the Houthis and Israel presents a significant challenge. Genocidal actions that it has been taking in Gaza would be significantly more difficult to undertake just because that distance. They're definitely more on the radar for Israel. Israel is attempting to infiltrate, conduct intelligence operations, as we saw with the assassination of the Houthi civilian leadership. So they're definitely more proactive now.
Why is Israel going after the Houthis so hard right now? Why have they become a priority at all? Because the Houthis actually pose very little risk to Israel, don't they?
That Israel has been able to turn to the Houthis precisely because it has seen such a success on its other fronts, in the sense of taking advantage of the collapse of the former Syrian government and being able to establish essentially what they term a demilitarized zone, or an effectively Israeli policed and occupied zone in the south of Syria. They've been able to get massive political concessions out of Hezbollah in the form of the ceasefire. They've been acting essentially unimpeded in Gaza. What international pressure they have faced has been completely outbalanced by the US's support for the genocide. And then with Iran, that was a proactive Israeli measure that the Iranians had to respond to. Since the unity of fronts pushed by the Axis has kind of crumbled away, Israel doesn't have a significant other force currently to focus on. It does have in its presence in Gaza against the Qassam brigades, but in terms of external operations, it has the maneuvering room. It's essentially just Yemen enacting the blockade and sending missiles to Israel, meaning that they have that, let's say, elbow room to respond when they don't have a threat on the coming from their northern border or from Iraq and Syria in the form of drones and such.
Iran's proxies in the region have weakened. What is Iran doing right now? Is it likely to withdraw its support from the Houthis, cut its losses, strike a deal with the US, or will it do the opposite and double down on its last standing power in the region?
In my view, Iran has at many points shown that it was wishing to pursue some kind of cooperation or deal with the US and with the Western powers, but this has been largely greeted by the US and Israel, where they see flexibility they perceive as weakness. They've doubled down and pushed harder on it, which has essentially forced a stronger Iranian response. What we see is flip-flopping rhetoric coming from Iran, in the sense that Pezeshkian was looking for a deal, an off-ramp from snapback, because that'll be, again, a severe blow to just the Iranian economy, to the civilian population's daily life. It's difficult to see how Iran will respond to. I think it'll be likely backed into a corner where it will pursue a more aggressive foreign policy. But for now, it's still been trying to weave that thread into a kind of agreement. What we saw, for example, with regards to the Houthis, was this verbal ceasefire that just suddenly ended Operation Rough Rider, these US-led strikes under the Trump administration. This kind of, let's say, direct informal diplomacy that has characterized the Trump administration is something that I think Iran believes it could deal with or leverage into a deal that Trump has so often looked for. But it seems that while for the US, the deal with the Houthis is genuine, it has mostly been a measure to either buy time or bide time and push for further, military, political, strategic pressure on Iran, coordinated with Israel.
Is there a world, do you think, that the Houthis could strike back at Israel in a way that actually impacts its security?
Them alone, they can't enact some kind of world-ending economic or military pressure on Israel. The Red Sea blockade has seen a significant impact on Israeli Red Sea communities with the shutting down of the Eilat port, and they have been able to scratch Israel in that way. But since the collapse of the unity of fronts, what we've seen is simply a lack of volume of fire that is able to interrupt critical Israeli infrastructure, such as airports, military functioning, interrupt Israeli civilian daily life, with US military ships in the Red Sea, with Israel's capabilities. They alone, I don't think, can enact a significant volume of fire that would be noticeable to Israeli state and society. Whereas before, coordinated with Iran and Hezbollah, they were able to impose an intolerable kind of state that pushed Israel to invade southern Lebanon, for example.
With the so-called axis of resistance weakening, there is a power vacuum, and the Houthis know this. I spoke to Elizabeth Kendall, president of Girton College at Cambridge University and an expert on militant groups in the region. She says, at the moment, there may actually be an opportunity for the Houthis to gain more power.
So we tend to think of this as all bad. Oh my goodness, their paymasters, Iran, their suppliers, Iran, their trainers, Hezbollah, and their ideological brothers in the axis of resistance are all suffering now. So they must be terribly upset. There's an element of that, but there's also an element of opportunity for the Houthis. And this is often missed. The Houthis will enjoy having more of a leadership position within the axis. And we've seen them already start to branch out, trying to make new relationships with groups. I mean, these are very nascent relationships. I don't want to exaggerate, but with groups like Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and even a kind of arrangement, let's not say allies exactly, but an arrangement with Al-Qaeda, fi Jazirat al-Arab. And so this is an opportunity for them to be the big guys, to have the respect of the region for being the ones who are still standing through voice and actions, standing up for Palestine.
But the Houthis can't exactly sustain themselves this way forever. Elizabeth says eventually there might come a point where they come undone.
What I think will happen is that over the long term, the deterioration in support from Hezbollah and Iran specifically, this will affect them. And in the short term, the Houthis will lash out. They'll want to make sure that their security for their main leaderships are safe. And they'll want to surround themselves by arch loyalists. They're going to start surrounding themselves with people who are close to them in lineage, in any kind of leadership position. Well, that might make them safer in the short term. In the long term, it's going to annoy people. Because whenever you embrace a particular favoured group, that's going to leave a lot of senior people out. That means that there will be grumblings and dissatisfaction amongst the leadership. And when that starts, that's good news for the anti-Houthi forces, because what you want is infighting. You want there to be rifts, disagreements, because then you can exploit that.
Whatever the fate of the Houthis is in the long run, they are far too dominant and integrated within Yemen itself. They have influence and control over vast territory, and more Israeli strikes would bring more misery to the civilian population of the areas under their control without necessarily doing much to dismantle the group, at least in the foreseeable future. So what is the alternative?
We have this seemingly intractable problem where the Houthis must be part of a solution in Yemen. They have to be. They can't be ignored, and they can't all be killed. There are too many of them, and they control too much territory, and they've always been there. So they've got to be part of a solution. But the problem is that the UN roadmap and any power sharing agreement at the moment, it's going to have to leave the Houthis in charge of the territory, at least part of the territory that they control. And that involves coastline. So whilst they have to be part of an agreement, at the same time, they can't be part of an agreement, because you cannot leave this group in its current form in charge of coastline, which they can always hold to ransom. You can't exclude them, but you can't have these radicals in charge.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines this week. This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi and audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Du'a Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. Thank you for listening.